Hollywood has long dominated big-budget animated films, but that may be coming to an end. Europe's animators are going from strength to strength, bolstered by a non-profit association based in Brussels called, fittingly, Cartoon. It was set up in 1999, and its aim is to accelerate the financing and distribution of European animated features. The figures bear proof of Cartoon's success. 123 fully financed European animation movies in the past 10 years. France leads the way with 41 full-length productions to its name. That's double the output compared to the 20 years before that. But there are two parts to a strong film industry: production and distribution. Where distribution is concerned, America remains king. In a bid to level the playing field, the French association Europa Distribution has united animation companies from 18 countries under one umbrella and received an innovation award for it.
Europe has a multiplicity of cultures, but I think we're moving more and more towards European strategies in terms of animation distribution. That's why we created Europa Distribution, so the distributors Europe-wide could work together.
We have to think like the major American movie companies and put in place joint strategies which can bring us bigger audiences.
Je pense plus de résultats en termes d'audience.
The production schedule of computer animation can be as long as for hand-drawn films. This German production has been in the pipeline for 10 years. By the time it hits the screens, it may be able to take advantage of new, cheaper and easier distribution possibilities, namely digital distribution.
Six years ago, Luca Di Gesù started his bakery right next door to a recently opened McDonald's in the Italian city of Altamura, not far from Bari. At first, most of the town's population of 65,000 welcomed the fast food restaurant. They said it would bring jobs. But the novelty soon wore off. Despite offering such specials as free birthday parties or big-screen football games, McDonald's closed its doors less than 2 years after it opened. On the other hand, this fourth-generation baker's shop has thrived, and so has the international attention on Di Gesù, who's been hailed as a modern-day David, taking on Goliath, in this case McDonald's. Although the story is not new, it continues, especially in Italy, where the concept of slow food was created, a concept to eat well, to eat locally, and of course slowly. And it's the kind of story which films are made of. Focaccia Blues, set to be released next year, is a parody between modern and ancient, old and new. The Corvette drives into Altamura, set to change or seduce cultures and traditions in a city, in this case which dates back to the 5th century BC. The film, like the focaccia, is homegrown. The director and most of its actors are from the region of Puglia. But the director insists the film is not anti-American, but a celebration of what is good, in this case, to eat.
We wanted to tell this story using a metaphor. It's not true that globalization always wins. It's not true at all. On the contrary, this pretty little thing, this little piece of focaccia, if you take it all over the world, it becomes the symbol of fragrance. I found focaccia in New York. Now that we've made focaccia blues, we'll put America and focaccia together to make focaccia more international. But we're not the guys who want to make money out of focaccia. We're the guys who believe in the David who beat Goliath. This is our goal. In the meantime, we'll eat some focaccia and enjoy life.
Mars, the red planet, our fascinating and mysterious neighbor. Satellites and probes have been studying Mars since the mid-1960s. And yet two fundamental questions still remain. Where is the water that once flowed on the surface? And is there, or was there ever, life on Mars? Europe's Mars Express mission set out in 2003 to help find the answers.
I think the chances that there may have been life early in the history of Mars are good.
Mars is a planet which is, I would say, very much alive.
Can life go underground and disappear? Can water go underground and disappear?
To answer those questions, data from Mars Express is being used to compare Mars with Earth. There are some obvious differences. Mars is half the size of Earth, and the surface environment is harsh. The average Martian temperature is minus 55 degrees Celsius, and the thin atmosphere, made up of 95% carbon dioxide, offers little protection from the sun's rays. The atmospheric pressure is just 1% of that on Earth, far too low for liquid water to remain on the surface. But there are some important similarities.
Mars shows a variety of geological phenomena like volcanism, like polar caps, like transparent atmosphere, like glaciers that are only shared with the Earth. These are the two planets in the whole solar system to have these features.
François Pirette is no ordinary tourist. That's his stage name to begin with. He's one of Belgium's most popular veteran comedians. Well, among the French speakers he is. A sketch he did in 2005 inspired a major rift between the Francophones and the Dutch speakers. His character was a Flemish minister whose tone changes depending on which media he's talking to.
Belgium is the living proof that very different communities can live together in complete harmony simply by sharing the same ideals and values. Now you listen to me, we're going to keep Brussels, you keep the king. You're going to need the crown for when we bury Belgium, because with me in 2008, Belgium's like Capri, fini, it's over, get it?
There wasn't any breakup. 2 years later, Belgians in their thousands marched united to keep their country together, French speakers, Dutch speakers and German speakers. The intercommunal mood is still tense, the identity crisis still sticking in François Pirette's throat.
The same as anywhere in the world, in Belgium, it's common to find road signs using red and white. So we let loose with the paint on all the traffic poles until it dawned on some Flemish politician in a bad mood that these are the Walloon colours. Sure, or the colours of Monaco, for that matter. Anyway, he convinced his mates to repaint theirs in their colours, black and yellow. So, my country was repainting its traffic poles while the rest of the world moved on. We got stuck at the lights.
Thierry van Carburg, that's the comedian's real name, went on with his work and his stage show was televised. It broke audience records.
I went to do the washing the other day. It was high time. Things had got rather grubby.
A visit to Volkswagen in Wolfsburg, Germany. Yorgo Katsimakakis is here as an observer. He is responsible for a report preparing a draft law aimed at steering the EU's auto industry into the future. Cars 21 looks at new ways to hug the road and keep abreast of the competition. There are 12 million jobs at stake. This industry is one of Europe's biggest employers.
glaube, allen Automobilherstellern in Deutschland, aber auch in Europa.
All of Germany's and Europe's car makers are aware that they have to adapt very fast, but the change has to be feasible. Unrealistic demands are out. They would lead to sackings in Europe, and no one wants that. We want to keep the jobs here. We also want a new fuel which everyone can afford to hit the market very fast.
Und trotzdem neue Technologie bezahlbar für alle Menschen sehr schnell auf den Markt kommt.
Merci.
The Commissioner for Industry, Gunther Verheugen, began the Cars 21 initiative. The Environment Commissioner Stavros Dimas equally, 2 years ago. Taking a step towards the industry should not mean making concessions on the environment, however. And the Greens say Cars 21 lacks any real vision for the future of our automobile society.
The automobile industry plays a big, powerful role in Brussels. It does everything it can so that its interests are at the centre of attention. Of course, there's nothing surprising in that. But in my opinion, the policy should take a broader view of the problem and should not give way when it comes to defining the car of the future.
It's 5 a.m. at Krakow's University of Agriculture in Poland. They might look like bakers, but in fact they're specialists in human nutrition. They mix flour, water, fresh yeast and salt in predetermined proportions and leave the dough to ferment for an hour. The researchers want to know how the fermentation process affects glucose levels in the blood of those who eat it. And they have a theory.
We know that the longer the fermentation process, the more alcohol and carbon dioxide is produced in the dough. Both these products are produced by simple sugars, and it's these sugars which are responsible for a high glycemic index in bread. So we reckon that if the dough ferments for longer, the bread will produce less glucose in humans, because the simple sugars will have been transformed into alcohol and gases in the baked bread. So there'll be less sugar to be absorbed by the body. These experiments should help us to confirm that theory.
The bread is baked for 20 minutes at 230 degrees Celsius. Then it's sliced into portions of exactly 111 grams. Before the second part of the experiments begin.
The participants will now eat these rolls and will measure the glucose concentration in the blood.
15 guinea pigs, all students at the university, eat the 111 grams of bread. And blood samples are taken at different stages of the digestion process. 4 samples in about an hour and a half. Volunteers think this research is vital to improve the nutritional qualities of the bread of the future.
Today, a French driver doesn't know how to drive a German train and vice versa. In a French train, the accelerator handle is on the right and the brake is on the left. In a German train, at the moment, it's the other way around.
Dans un train allemand, aujourd'hui c'est l'inverse.
So it's difficult to work in a common system because of the technical history we've inherited. We had to find a solution.
And this is it, a common European train for a common continental railway. An intercity train able to cope with all signalling systems throughout Europe at up to 300 kilometers per hour. But it's taken 4 years of research just to develop this mock-up. They've started from scratch, redesigning traction systems, brakes, controls. They've even looked at interior design. And all so the new train is familiar to any European driver and will be familiar to any European passenger. And that included designing buttons which could be easily understood by all nationalities. Engineer Martin Schober coordinated the carriage design.
This train has a spacious entrance with bars to hold on to. We've also put the door opening buttons lower down for wheelchair users. And for the first time there's an emergency column which combines all functions like emergency stop, door opening and communication. There's an illuminated strip showing the exit if there's a power failure. There's another large space which allows access to the toilet, which is equally big inside, so a wheelchair user can get in and maneuver the chair. For travellers with young children, there's a nappy changing table. There are several emergency buttons, all fitted with tactile symbols, and an SOS button at floor level for anyone who's fallen and needs help.
July the 20th, 1969, and a new page in the history books is being written. Apollo 11's lunar module, Eagle, was heading for the surface of the moon.
Contact light. Okay, engine stop. We copy you down, Eagle.
Well, it was the middle of the night, and I was sitting with my parents, and we had a tiny little black and white television screen.
It's very pretty out here. Are you getting a TV picture now, Houston?
I was, as a 6-year-old kid, glued to the television station, watching the reports from the lunar landing.
Hey, you got it? That's a good step. Beautiful view. Isn't that something?
We couldn't see anything at all because the pictures were terrible, and we were sitting there going, is that his foot? No, that's the moon. No, that's the spacecraft. We couldn't see anything, but we knew it was important.
I hope you're watching how hard I have to hit this into the ground to the tune of about 5 inches, Houston.
We had a black and white television set in our living room, and it was a big excitement seeing this achievement.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
At Aberystwyth University in the west of Wales, there's a research department dedicated to the solar system. They can test robots here to judge their suitability for the exploration of the moon or Mars. And there's always discussion about how the Earth's only natural satellite came to be.
What they brought back gave us a theory, which was that the Earth and the Moon formed with a giant impact. It made an awful lot of mess. For a while the Earth would have had rings like Saturn. That ring recondensed to form the Moon we know now. And they made that theory in order to explain why the material they brought back looked like Earth material. Over the next 40 years, we've looked at that material more and more closely and realised that, in fact, it isn't the same material as the Earth. It must have come from the other impactor, the Mars-like object. People sometimes call it Theia. And so that theory has completely been turned on its head since it was first formed. But it's still the best theory there is.
By definition, a rare disease affects less than 1 in 2,000 people. Symptoms are often picked up at birth or appear in early childhood. Because they've received so little attention from health authorities and the drug companies, sufferers, or more often their families, have created their own support groups and associations. By coming together in this way, they've been able to raise public awareness and improve patient care, and, crucially, push for more research to be done into the diseases. It starts with diagnosis, and that's when Newcastle General Hospital's Muscle Centre first begins to help patients and their families.
Children with rare neuromuscular diseases can present at any age, from tiny babies right through to teenagers. But in most children, we're beginning to pick up the signs at about the time they're starting school, when they're going to nursery and they have difficulty getting up off the floor with the other children, difficulty keeping up with their peers at PE and things like that. That's when we mainly see the first signs.
Colour a little bird.
We've seen a lot of developments for treatments for these kind of disorders over the last few years. We're now 20 years on from the discovery of the first gene involved in muscle conditions, and over that period people have developed the animals that they can study to develop new treatments in. They've shown that you can replace these faulty genes, that you can upregulate some of them, that you can modify them in different ways to make them function better.
At the Institute of Human Genetics at the city's university, a team of researchers is working on rare inherited muscular diseases. Some 80% of rare diseases involve one or more genes or chromosomal abnormalities.
There's currently still no cure for any of the genetic muscle diseases. But I think the encouraging news for patients is that there are a lot of concepts that came from preclinical studies in cells and animal models, that we are now bringing to the next step, to the clinical level. These things will take time. If you find a new compound today, it will probably take at least 5 to maybe 10 years to get it to the market. It's important that patients, when they get a treatment, get a safe treatment.
Frequent dust storms claw at the former seabed, blowing away sand, salt and chemical compounds from farming activities. It's a poisoned cocktail that local residents breathe every day. This bleak scenario is now under scrutiny in a European research project called CALTA.
Firstly, we want to understand what's happening with dust storms here in Central Asia, and particularly around the Aral Sea, because the last studies ceased after the USSR's collapse. Dust ignores borders. Dust from here can be blown to Europe and other parts of the world. We want to know how much dust and salt is blown away, its composition and direction. Secondly, we want to propose solutions to lessen the consequences of these dust storms.
Some 300 kilometers from the Aral Sea, researchers visit this weather station to install dust traps. Particles trapped during dust storms are weighed, measured and analysed. Scientists estimate that storms can blow away up to 400 kilos of dust per hectare every month in places like this.
We've measured the size and mineral makeup of dust particles using techniques like radiofluorescence. With this data, we've been able to find where they come from, and we have a hypothesis. If this dust comes in part from the former seabed of the Aral, it should be rich in salt. And we've been able to confirm that this is the case. Salt from the Aral has been carried all this way.
CGen turbines work like submerged windmills, but instead of being driven by air, they're driven by water. They can be installed in the sea at places with high tidal current velocities, or in places with fast enough continuous ocean currents.
We sited the turbine here for a number of reasons, one of which is that it's a very aggressive site from a tidal stream velocity point of view. It's one of the most aggressive tidal streams around the coast of the UK.
When fully operational, CGen's twin rotors will operate for up to 20 hours per day, producing electricity both on ebb and flood tides. It will produce 4 times more electricity than any tidal stream project currently in operation.
This unit has a rated capacity to generate of 1.2 megawatts. So to put that into context, that would provide the electricity needs of a largish village of, say, 800 homes. If you were to put a number of tidal turbines together in a farm, then you've got a technology which is, or the size of capacity of a farm, which is certainly could compete with offshore wind farms today.
But CGen is not only required to produce commercial amounts of electricity, it needs to do it without impacting the environment. Strangford Loch is a conservation area, home to many bird and animal species. While CGen's footprint above the surface of the loch is minor, environmentalists are concerned that its massive 16-metre rotors operating beneath the surface could represent a hazard to curious species like seals.
The main species or animals that are interest here are the common seal, or the harbour seal as it's sometimes called, and also the benthos. That is the animals that live on the seabed itself. Those two areas, but particularly the common seal, because we know that the common seal population in the whole of Western Europe is declining quite significantly, and obviously that species has to be really at the top of the list of concern.
One of the purposes of space science is to learn how to work together, how the Americans work with Europeans, how European teams work with Russians or with Chinese or Indians or Japanese. Then you've learnt the vocabulary of communication. And don't get me wrong, the cultures are very different, but you learn to work together. You learn where your strengths lie and where you can rely on the strengths of others.
Once the main themes were decided, scientists from across Europe set forth their proposals for 2015-2025. 51 projects made it through the first round of selection.
If we just said, give us the best ideas you can, they would come up with very, very big, expensive ideas, because scientists are certainly not limited in imagination. So we brought up the idea of, well, if you get a smaller mission, an M mission, a medium mission, you're likely to see it fly earlier than the large mission. This may be common sense to an ordinary person, but to a scientist it needs to be explained.
The proposed cosmic vision missions were split into the fields of astrophysics and solar system science. They were then divided up into M medium-term and L long-term projects. From the 51 in the first round, a total of 8 have made the cut, 4 M missions and 4 L missions. All are exactly the kinds of projects Southwood feels ESA should be tackling.
The scientific goals are almost unquestionably fundamental. You could never have the nerve to propose something that might cost 600, 700 million euros just from our contribution, and then you think of involving other countries, maybe you're talking certainly over €1 billion. You've got to be able to stand up and honestly say, this will change the way we see our universe.
Here in Aberdeen, Scotland, bad eating habits are proving hard to change. Researchers believe that an effective solution to weight problems lies in following active daily lives. 56-year-old lab technician Ian Benzie wears an electronic device that monitors his movements. He may not look it, but according to his body mass index, he is considered clinically overweight. The device is connected to 5 different sensors on the body. Every second of the day it knows whether Ian Benzie is sitting or standing, walking or running, going up and down stairs, even which side he's lying on when asleep. A total of 40 different activities. It's another research thread, part of the Diogenes project.
It's helped me to understand more about my body as I'm getting older, and it's given me a healthier lifestyle, a bit more exercise, so it keeps me in trim and stops me getting too fat and lazy.
Every few days Ian visits researcher Stephen Wybrow in Aberdeen's Rowett Institute.
So you've got the idea fitted? Yep.
Data collected from his monitor is analysed, then compared with similar research gathered on sporting activities like cycling. Initial results suggest that overweight may be better prevented through daily activity rather than through intense sports.
What we believe is that although running marathons or cycling or so forth or mountain climbing will be very effective for some people, for other people it's less effective, and other people may be better off just being more active throughout the day. I mean, the common one is walking 10,000 steps a day or climbing the stairs rather than taking the lift or the elevator. What we want to do is actually put numbers on how effective these activities are at keeping weight off.
I've been working in Greek companies for 9 years, at Chariessa for 5. There are more jobs with the Greeks. Without them, we'd all be out of work. Thanks to them, we earn a living, not only in Sandanski, but also in Blavgorod and Petrich. We thank God for Greek enterprise. Thanks to them, we can work.
Greek textiles set up in Bulgaria because the workers are not unionized. They work more flexible hours, they never go on strike and accept far lower salaries.
The base salary for workers here in Bulgaria since January is more or less 120 euros a month. In Greece, it's 600 or 650, if I'm not mistaken. Competition in our sector is really tough. There's China and other countries in the east, such as Turkey, which manages to pull prices even lower. The simple reason that lets us stay in the market is the quality of products from Greek companies, even those in Bulgaria and Romania, whatever country Greek entrepreneurs are established in.
Eastward delocalization is not considered likely to be temporary as competition pressure from Asia is constant. The perspective from a Bulgarian member of the European Parliament.
As this is happening in the south, Bulgarian companies are losing contracts to Chinese suppliers or having to relocate to China in order to use the benefit of lower labor costs there. The challenge that we face in Europe is not the basic challenge that we face in Europe is how to invest in a more competitive economy of the future in order to be competitive as a European Union against global players, including China, India, Brazil, Russia, and...
Today it's an ecology field trip on wastewater and its treatment. The experiments take place in Freeland, a community some 8 kilometres from the school. Here every household has to treat its own wastewater. Carlos Arias is a Colombian research assistant at the University of Aarhus. He's come along to explain to the children the differences between the several classes of wastewater and how important it is to treat them all.
Kids learn a lot about wastewater here. They can see it, they can smell it. They realize that it's important for the wastewater to be treated before it's thrown back into the environment, so that it's not harmful. With these practical lessons, we try to make them more aware. We try to make them understand that polluted water can be very harmful to nature, but also that, well treated, it can become a natural resource.
Wastewater is cleaned here with the help of these willows. The roots filter many of the polluting particles in suspension. Students measure the level of underground wastewater and its effect on the tree's growth. Partially cleaned wastewater ends in this pond, where the rainwater, natural sediments and plants clean it more. Students measure the water's pH and then, with the help of small colour, matches water's great enemies: nitrates, phosphates and ammonia.
I knew that water could be cleaned, but I thought that cleaning was done with machines, not plants.
Cleaning wastewater is an important thing to do to preserve the environment and also the atmosphere.
The school is taking part in a European research project aimed at helping children to learn natural sciences with the help of wastewater. Hands-on experimentation's a plus for learning sciences, say both Carlos Arias
the project coordinator in Denmark, and Gert Bilander, the school's science teacher.
I think it's important that children learn about wastewater because they need to have the understanding that nothing just disappears. That in the modern society you don't actually see what happened with our garbage and with our wastewater and so on. You just throw out in the toilet and it's gone. But it's not gone.
It's jet ski. It's my favourite thing in the whole world, I have to say. Any chance I get to go out on the water, we go out into Poole Harbour and out into the ocean. I could jump waves, I could do all sorts of things, and it makes me very happy.
After surviving a stroke at the age of 12, Marcy Lelliot was left paralysed on one side. Today she lives an active life, works as a teacher of disabled children, and is gradually getting movement back into her left hand.
We've developed an implant that goes into the forearm where 2 sets of electrodes are attached to muscle bundles, nerve bundles, which operate 2 functions. The first function is to extend the wrist, and the second function is to open the fingers.
The implant in Marcy's forearms is powered and controlled wirelessly by the removable box strapped over it. Like the activity monitor, the StymieGrip system uses accelerometers to detect its position. A specific arm movement triggers electrical stimulation of muscles and nerves to open and close the wrist and fingers. Marcy has become one of the first patients to use the newly developed device.
Up until this point, there's been very little that has been able to be done for the upper limb in stroke. To a large extent, it's been ignored by the medical profession and people have just been left to get on with it. We now have a possibility of offering a new treatment for people who have not been able to use their hands, and this really is a first.
The device has several program modes to control or exercise the wrist in different situations.
You can feel the implant if you press it. It's quite lumpy, but you can't see it. Apart from the scar, you can't actually see it. When the electricity is actually going through into the arm, it just feels a bit like pins and needles, really, but not nasty. You kind of get used to it. It's just a bit of a sort of tingle. The Healthy Aims project is very exciting for me, and just to be involved in something for stroke patients, and if it helps me, then great, but it'll help people in the future.
Rotterdam's sulfur dioxide readings today are down 80% from 1970 levels. Throughout Europe, similar reductions took the bite out of acid rain. An online emissions register shows how industries in Europe are making an effort over pollutants. But a growing volume of traffic remains. In Europe today, there are 3 times as many vehicles as there were in the 1970s. Laws promoting cleaner fuels have been introduced, but medical research over the last decade has proved disturbing. Experts say average life expectancy has been shortened by around 9 months.
About 370,000 people will die prematurely every year from health-related problems associated with air pollution. These particles enter people's lungs, and particularly the small ones. They enter the lung, and then it's very hard for your natural biological systems to remove these particles. So they interact with your lungs, and, for example, if you're asthmatic, they will cause you severe problems.
European air pollution laws have improved dramatically since the EU's founding, but environmentalists warn that water quality has suffered with Europe's growing prosperity. In Worms, Germany, this building houses a control station monitoring the Rhine River. One of Europe's longest, it crosses 6 countries. As long as there's been industry, it's been vital. At the same time, it is a water source for more than 50 million people. Students visit the monitoring centre to learn about protecting their water. This teacher recalls what the river used to be like.
Summer 1964
was the last time I swam in the Rhine. It smelled so bad and was so polluted, I felt nauseous and was sick. I said then I wouldn't swim here anymore, and I haven't done so since. I'd rather like to swim across again, but I don't dare to. I'm a bit out of practice. If someone swam with me or just kept an eye on me, I'd like to, in the summer.
Age-old chants passed down from father to son encourage the fishermen with their haul. Their traditional fishing methods have changed little over the centuries along the coast of Senegal.
2 months ago we were fishing at night, as we couldn't fish in the daytime as there weren't any fish. These days we've noticed there are far fewer.
Amar has fished in these Atlantic waters for 40 years. Together with his fellow fishermen, he's after the fish called sardinella. Both flat and round sardinella are closely related to the herring and are considered a local delicacy. Today's catch is not that great. Once again, there are too few fish and many are far too small.
When we were young, we saw lots of different kinds of fish, which these days we don't see anymore. It's a different era. We used to call some of these herrings 4-metre fish as they were so big, but they've disappeared.
Overfishing along the Senegalese coast, both by local fishermen and big foreign factory ships, is driving these sardinellas and dozens of other species to the brink of extinction. These scientists want to know how to prevent such an outcome. Every day they come down to the port to estimate the daily catch. By talking to the fishermen, they calculate how many boats sail, how much time they usually spend offshore, and then they measure some of the specimens.
With our research, we're hoping to improve the management of resources, and to do that we must find out just how many fish are being caught and brought ashore. From this research we can estimate the extent of Senegal's fish stocks. After the catch is landed, I take a sample back to the laboratory to find out just when the fish would be likely to lay its eggs.
In the lab, the fish are weighed and measured, and then their internal organs are studied. The sex of the fish can then be established. Scientists claim that overfishing of young, immature fish can drive a whole species to the brink of extinction. More Silla wants to know if these fish were mature enough to have laid eggs at least once before being caught.
Joseph Le Villain and Jean-Claude Mazambou are regular visitors to this eucalyptus plantation near Pointe-Noire, the economic capital of the Republic of the Congo in Central Africa. Of interest to them are the tree's wood and foliage. Researchers measure and weigh the leaves, both growing and fallen. They want to know how many nutrients and how much CO2 these trees can absorb at different stages of their lives.
Eucalyptus is a plant that grows very quickly, so it traps carbon quickly. The plant will feed off atmospheric CO2. Once the carbon's inside the trunk, some of it is fixed in the wood. The plant also transfers it into the ground, the bark, the branches and the leaves. These will decompose to form an organic matter that's pretty much carbonized, with nitrogen and other mineral elements.
What the researchers have to do is measure carbon levels in the tree's roots and surrounding soil. Several holes are dug 6 meters deep to recover underground water at different depths. The samples are dispatched to a laboratory to help answer various questions.
Is it carbon that's existed here for centuries, or has it only been here since man's arrival? Lots of burning goes on in the area, and then on top of that there's been lots of building here. Did man bring the carbon with him?
Unindustrialized and sparsely populated, but for a small urbanized corner of the country, 60% of the Republic of the Congo is forest. It is therefore not a heavy polluter. The carbon cycle here remains a mystery, as it does in most of sub-Saharan Africa. No one quite knows how much CO2 or other greenhouse gases the continent produces.
"500 kilometres north of the quake's epicenter, in the countryside near Venice, engineers are weaving a tangled web of the 21st century. The European research project Polytect is working on the multifunctional textiles of the future. These materials are intended to protect structures during or after earthquakes, landslides and other natural disasters. With sensors built in, they'll be able to see, hear and smell trouble before it happens.
The idea is simply to make structures more like the human body and to build a skin for the structures by assessing pairings of sensors. We can build a relationship with the structure over time and to ideally conduct what's called structural health monitoring, which hopes to answer 4 questions. Those 4 questions are, is there damage present? Where is that damage on the structure? How severe is that damage? And then lastly, what does this damage mean? What is the life of the structure after this damage has occurred?
And they're already well advanced with some prototypes.
So here's a very nice example of a textile that's intended for a masonry structure. As you can see, the glass fibers go in many different directions because the stresses and the loads in a structure go in many different directions. And here we have a fiber optic cable that we can send light through to assess the health or the status of a structure. For our geotechnical products, we can use a filter type structure, or we can use a grid-like type of material to both strengthen the soil or to filter water and still be able to pass light through our sensors to interrogate whether or not that soil is moving. Another very interesting application are these 3D rope-like structures with fiber optic cables inside, and we can make these fiber optic cables sensitive to chemicals. So using this technique, we can detect whether or not a chemical is present or not in a landfill and the temperature of that landfill.
To improve drivers' skills through the virtual world is another avenue being explored by researchers. Heidi is involved in a European project called Train All. It's aimed to develop simulators of the future. Bikers, truckers, ambulance or ordinary drivers require specific software developed to individual needs. For younger drivers, the problem is the relationship between speed and distance.
In the future, there will be more driving schools using more and more simulators for driver training, not only for novice car drivers, but also for other type of drivers like emergency drivers from police or fire stations or ambulance services. They all need to be trained.
Here in Bavaria at the Police Executive Training Centre, the Force is participating in the project. They're pioneers in this area. Here, trainee police receive mandatory training in emergency situations. For this, they use a sophisticated simulator tailored to their needs, a system unique in Europe.
The big difference between normal driving and driving for emergency services is that in a normal situation, drivers react to other traffic. In an emergency situation, the traffic around must respond to the emergency vehicle, and that is very difficult to recreate in the virtual world.
Here, performance is assessed. For the young officers, mistakes are not that obvious, hence the importance of the training. One of the benefits of the simulator is that it allows the student to go over their performance and analyse any errors.
An allergic reaction is a dysfunction of the immune system. A normally harmless substance is perceived as a threat by the body. Scientists call this an allergen. On first contact, the immunizing cells produce antibodies, in particular a class of immunoglobulins known as IgE. These antibodies will then fix on other cells of the skin and mucous membranes. On second contact with the allergens, the cells release chemical substances, including histamine, which provoke an allergic reaction. The symptoms vary from a mere redness to swellings, an asthma attack, or even an anaphylactic shock, which can be fatal. Any ingredient, even just a trace of it, can cause an allergic reaction, but the principal culprits are now recognized: nuts, eggs, milk, corn, groundnut, fish and seafood. But the number of people affected is often overestimated. In Europe, only 2 to 4% of adults suffer from food allergies, and only around 6% of children under the age of 3. Here in Vienna, Austria, at the capital's central hospital, researchers are also participating in the EURO2010 project. They're focusing on improving allergy diagnosis. To find the allergens, the doctor talks to the patient to get a general view, then carries out various tests. One in particular involves pricking the skin and adding a sample of the suspect food. A few minutes later, the doctor analyzes the patient's reactions.
Being allergic to certain foods is a very common allergy, especially in combination with hay fever. Often there's a crossover reaction. In other words, when people have an allergic reaction to birch, they often also react to some vegetables. This is the case with our patient today, who has an adverse reaction to birch, and likewise to some particles in apples, carrots and peaches.
With some allergens present in several substances, it's difficult to identify the source of the allergy. It's the work of the researchers to break down the constituent parts of the potential food allergen. They have to isolate, extract and purify each protein, all the better to analyze its structure and properties. The allergens, thus purified, make it possible to develop more reliable methods of diagnosis.
Attention pour le décompte final. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, unité, feu.
Space is a great adventure, but there's a practical side to living in space that the new automated transfer vehicle will address. The job of restocking the International Space Station's shelves. Mike Steinkopf, the ATV cargo operations engineer. Here we have a bag of toiletries for the crew. A comb, a brush and a toothbrush. Chocolate, preserves. Some tissues. And several t-shirts. All the things you need on the ground as well. But unlike life here on the ground, space presents some unique challenges, not least of which is the problem of supply. Astronauts on the ISS have to take everything with them for a trip of several months. An item forgotten is an item lost.
The astronauts have to live in space. They have to have clothes, they have to have entertainment, they have to have food obviously, water, gas. We take all that up.
And not only food, air and water for the crew, but also fuel and equipment intended for scientific use. The automated transfer vehicle will ensure that the astronauts orbiting home is fully equipped.
Diana Wrightson and her neighbour Jill Beebe are living on the edge, literally. Until last year, Diana ran a guest and tea house from her home in Haysborough. It's a small village on the east coast of England, about 3 hours from London.
Wasn't it amazing when it had that hole in it?
When Diana bought her house 26 years ago, the local authority assured her the sea defences built in the late 1950s would protect her home. But the barriers started wearing down in the 1990s, and the government claims they cost too much to repair.
The government now has decided that rural areas are not worth saving in this part of the country. But they're not prepared to pay property owners to go away, which is what we feel should happen. So at the moment, no, there's no compensation. So when I walk away from this house, all my life savings have gone.
Coastal erosion forced Diana to close her guest house last year. The garage and the beach road behind her house are both gone, and today her house stands less than 5 metres from the cliff. In 1999, her neighbour bought her house for €96,000. Today it's worth just over €1.
We bought the bungalow when my husband retired from work. We had a search done, and we were told that it was at least 50 years and we wouldn't have to worry about cliff erosion. Our neighbour next door to me was told when she bought her property that it would last 100 years. And now here we are on the brink.
Diana's guest house was once a popular tourist destination in the small town of Haysborough, population 850 people. The plight of Haysborough, like other coastal towns throughout Europe's, opened up a new debate. With climate change and rising sea levels now a scientific reality, the government warns it can't protect the entire coast. It's a bitter pill to swallow for local residents.
The instalment of the European institutions in this city gave it an enormous boost. With European civil servants earning significant salaries, the property market boomed. Tenants' associations today are hard-pressed. Wrongful rent increases or unhealthy conditions are among the problems they face every day. This woman has come to complain.
You have to push really hard here.
Immigrants are often the worst affected by housing problems. Around 30 people live in this block. The air is fetid.
You can see at once it doesn't seem too healthy, seeing the state of the balconies. And a quarter of what's available to rent in Brussels is in this condition, especially in the central areas.
A mother and her 3-year-old live here in a space of 30 square metres for a rent of €400.
Do you have rats and mice here?
Yes, we've had rats. Look at the holes over there. Mice and cockroaches. Look here.
Cockroaches in the carpets, rats under the floor, windows that won't close, seeping walls, mouse droppings behind the kitchen cabinets.
A lot of owners say this is the fault of the tenants. With 2 or 3 cockroaches, you could still say it's the food. But if there are rats and mice, what counts is to get the rent at the beginning of the month, full stop.
Roaming charges are very different from one EU state to another. A Cypriot visiting Belgium, for instance, might pay €12 to make a 4-minute call home, while a Finn in Belgium would only pay 51 cents to call home. The operators argue that competition is already at work in the market and that EU rules would create geographic imbalances. This roaming professional tells us.
More or less, the regulation would favour those countries which generate traffic more than the countries which receive the traffic. The Central and Northern European states generate more traffic generally than those in the south, such as Portugal. They are typically receivers. We'd have a very considerable plunge in roaming revenue. This is very important for national operations, and they would not be compensated by an eventual reduction in costs of our traffic abroad, which would be proportionally lower. This regulation is very negative, penalising for operators such as those in Portugal.
This scenario does worry regulatory bodies. Anacom is one of them. Its president is concerned that some consumers will lose out as operators do everything they can to make up for revenue losses.
The operators will see their roaming income drop and so can look at raising their intake from other sorts of national services. If it's like that at national level, travellers gain, but those who stay home will pay more.
National price rises should not happen, according to the European Consumer Bureau, because the claim by operators that price reductions mean they will earn far less is unproven.
Private consumers in particular will use their telephones, their mobiles abroad more, and will bring them abroad more if prices come down, if they can be sure they're not going to be hit with a huge bill. So the actual loss is not nearly as high as companies pretend it is.
Disabled athletes at the Olympic Training Centre in Morocco's capital Rabat push their physical limits. The country is taking another look at how its disabled people are integrated into Moroccan society. The young king has introduced a wave of reforms which have shaken up issues of disability in a social framework virtually everywhere in the country. There are 1.5 million disabled people in Morocco. The European Union is supporting the reforms through the organisation Handicap International and local partners. Even so, it's sometimes difficult to break through prejudice, something these athletes know only too well.
I'll give you an example. Too often the so-called normal people look negatively on us, disabled people, sometimes very negative.
Next to Rabat, Saleh, a city where there's a feel of commitment to the promotion of disabled people's rights. But in everyday life, there's still a lot that needs changing. In the 70s and 80s, the city experienced an influx of inhabitants from rural areas escaping problems of drought. Saleh remains a symbol of the anarchic urbanism of the time. Today, almost 1 million people live there, and 40,000 of them are disabled. Now, they are daring to demand that their rights be respected. Abdurrahman Moudni hasn't been able to go into the historic centre of Saleh for 8 years, since town planners redeveloped the zone without taking into account wheelchair access.
You can see the market opposite, for example, a central market where there's lots of economic activity, but with no means for a wheelchair to get there. No public place is accessible.
To make their voices heard, several organisations have grouped themselves together under an umbrella called the Collective to Promote Disabled People's Rights.
This patient suffers from what doctors call tetralogy of Fallot. The flow of blood from the right ventricle in his heart to the pulmonary valve was partially blocked. He underwent surgery, the obstruction was eliminated, and the right ventricle outflow was enlarged. But by doing so, the pulmonary valve was destroyed. Over time, that destruction causes a chronic flooding in the right ventricle. To prevent further danger to him, we must decide if and when we must perform new surgery to implant a new pulmonary valve.
The disease is complex, and cardiologists specializing with children often lack accurate, in-depth guidance on how to proceed. In a pilot experiment, Ugo's clinical data has been included in a new European-wide database. The network should allow Ugo's cardiologists to compare his case with other similar cases around Europe so they can share information and plan Ugo's treatment in a better way.
So the network has confirmed that there is in Europe a patient quite similar to mine. It is patient number 57, a boy from London. If we open the database for this patient, we will be able to analyse his clinical details. Here, for instance, we have a 3D graphic reconstruction of his right ventricle. And we can see from this data that this British boy was successfully operated on by surgeons. The implant of a new pulmonary valve was useful for him. He is healthier and doing fine. By studying this similar case, I can feel more reassured about my own case. If that surgery worked for that boy, it can also work for my patient.
The network is still experimental and part of a European research project aimed at providing paediatricians with new tools to tackle not only heart disease but also brain tumours and rheumatism.
Following the death of her father from Alzheimer's disease, Barbara Farlan has come to the research centre to have herself tested. Although only 62, she felt her mind was failing. In fact, tests of her memory and grasp of spatial relationships showed that she did not have the disease. She will return in 18 months.
I just wanted to check out if it's just ordinary, stress, and you have lots of things to think about, and you only take in what you think is important and you forget the less important stuff. But I thought I started to forget appointments, and when I walked upstairs to get a cup of coffee, and I came upstairs and I said, what am I doing here? What was it I was going to do? And sometimes I forget and I have to walk downstairs again and start from the beginning.
Testing involving memory quizzes is the first step in establishing a diagnosis. Early diagnosis is important to establish whether there may be other causes of cognitive impairment.
We are doing many memory tests so that we can really see if there is some memory problems. And then we have today some technical tools we can use to support our diagnosis. We are often doing MRI, neuroimaging, so that we can see how the brain structure is.
Magnetic resonance imaging, or MRI, has proven itself to be an invaluable diagnostic tool for doctors researching Alzheimer's disease as well as many other conditions. By placing the patient in a powerful magnetic field, 3D images can be obtained of the tissue being investigated. MRI scans clearly show what is happening in the brain. The scan on the left shows atrophy and shrinkage typical of advanced Alzheimer's disease, while the brain on the right is normal. But while researchers race to find a treatment, is there anything we can do to protect ourselves?
Now we know that there are many lifestyle-related factors like physical activity, active lifestyle in general, mental training, social activities that can also protect against Alzheimer's disease.
Above all, the aim of the Electra project is to develop a methodology of learning games. It's a methodology which could, in the end, be used for all subjects, applicable to French, maths, history, and then afterwards it could be personalized.
Et ensuite, on personnalise et on va demander en fait ton degré de confiance.
Peut-être que tu peux essayer d'activer le détecteur avec la torche?
Ah d'accord.
Ça ne marche pas. Le cône de lumière de la torche est trop grand.
If you look at the 21st century, computer games will certainly emerge as one of the most successful forms of leisure activity.
Est-ce que je peux vous aider, jeune homme?
Instead of getting wound up about the increasing amount of time computer games take up in the lives of our children, school kids, students and adults as well, we want to look at the game's successes, find out the principles and forces of motivation, the basic elements of success and why they're so popular. Then we want to take the secret ingredients of these computer games and use them in learning.
At the moment, the Electra game helps teach physics, in particular the propagation of light and how to create shadows. They chose physics because it's taught in a similar way at a similar age in Austria, Belgium, France and Germany.
Here, I'm trying to put the metal ball in the hole.
The project has been coordinated by the Laboratory for Mixed Realities in the German city of Cologne. It takes a unique multidisciplinary approach, bringing together computer game designers with experts in education, cognitive science and psychology. They decided the adventure game format would be ideal for learning.
It's a cold and cloudy spring afternoon on the monastic island of Reichenau, on the shores of Constanza Lake in southern Germany. Climbing the bell tower, where no tourists are allowed, is an unusual visitor with a small suitcase. He's part of a European effort to preserve, restore and improve the continent's bells, some of which are over 800 years old.
This is the oldest bell here, cast in 1361, and is part of UNESCO's World Heritage Site at Reichenau, whose bells are the only ones given this UN distinction. Right from the start of Christianity, bells were the symbol of harmony. People were convinced that evil was repelled by the sound waves. It was also a symbol of unity, of meeting.
From his small suitcase, he takes different diapasons that help him to identify and to measure a wide array of bell tones. Kurt Kramer has been studying bells for 40 years. He considers them to be the oldest known musical instrument, with their own mechanical soul.
It's only by thinking this way that I can really know this bell and its real character. If I look at the electronic measurements, I can understand its physics, but I don't really understand the bell. With the diapasons, and this is now confirmed by experts everywhere, I can really get to know a bell's true sound and character.
A colony on the moon would serve as a staging post before the major challenge of trying to send robotic and then human missions to Mars in the 2030s. While NASA will probably dominate proceedings, the European Space Agency will want to be on an equal footing. One of those watching the speech by the NASA representative closely was Umberto Guidoni, a former astronaut.
I think that these days, given the growing interest in space exploration, ESA has to set a new strategy on the issue. This strategy is already being set out to an extent with the Aurora project that plans a primary phase of robotic missions to the Moon, then to Mars to prepare the way for human missions.
The Aurora project has been underway since 2001, asserting Europe's interest in further exploration of our solar system while retaining a large degree of independence from potential partners in Russia, the US, China and elsewhere.
I can imagine how important this is going to be for Europe in terms of reaching the people, touching their hearts and creating a kind of European identity that we don't really have today. We need a large-scale project that can go straight to the Europeans' hearts, rather than their wallets or their sense of reason. I think that for a European, seeing a European astronaut setting foot on Mars would really unite Europe behind this dream.
Mettere piede su Marte servirebbe a unire tutta l'Europa su questo obiettivo, su questo sogno. The politicians and scientists have their dreams, and the taxpayer has to foot the bill. At the end of the day, the public needs to know that the project is worthwhile, that the world of science will benefit.
There are so many questions that we can address by going to the Moon and Mars. I think we must go to them both. It's not one or the other.
Scotland is more European than England is, but I'm disagreeing with the independence entirely, because I don't think it's a big enough country to survive.
There's no doubting that Scotland's got an identity, whether or not it's independent. Anywhere in Europe, people will recognise the word Scotland as separate from England or Wales or Ireland. It has that very clear cultural value. I think it's right to be proud of one's identity, proud of one's separatism, but I think there's too much at stake to be completely independent.
I was born and bred, and I'm proud to be Scottish. So, as far as we know, we're free, and freedom is where your heart is and where your home is.
TNT, or The New Tradition, is what this group calls itself. The quartet has just signed up with a Scottish label to record a first album. They describe themselves as a piping boys band. They want to bring the bagpipes back to the hit parade, promote Scottish identity that way, without worrying about politics.
I'm quite happy with how things are. I think it's really important to have your own identity. Playing the pipes is one way of doing that. Scotland as a whole is quite recognised all over the world as being its own country, quite independent, although we are kind of linked with Britain. But I think it's a fantastic place to be right now. The tradition and music as a whole is at an all-time high. I've never seen so many youngsters take up the bagpipes or a traditional instrument. So it's really thriving right now. It's a great place to be, great music, and hopefully we're contributing to that.
Scientific research warns of unknown long-term effects of exposure to pesticides. Research at the University of Southern Denmark is examining possible developmental dysfunctions in children of local greenhouse workers. Professor Philippe Grandjean is an expert in environmental medicine. He's looking at the brain functions of children who've been exposed to poisonous substances. In a previous study of 90 pesticides and 200 chemicals on the development of an infant's brain, autism, hyperactivity, mental disability and a lower IQ are just some of the symptoms he's identified. Yet the new EU legislation on chemicals, REACH, fails to recognise this.
What we're talking about is a pandemic that is essentially affecting millions and millions of children worldwide because they're exposed to lead, mercury, certain solvents like toluene, arsenic, various pesticides, other industrial chemicals. And all of these exposures are, each of them, they are just taking off a little bit of brain function. And they're not causing frank disease as such, because then it would be easy to see for the physicians. They would make all of these diagnoses, oh, this is a typical pesticide poisoning. No, what's happening is that the brain development is inhibited, and therefore the brain that these children end up with is deficient, so that they are not functioning as well as they could have done. Future generations will pay a price, a very serious price, for the small benefits that we have gained from the short-term use of pesticides now.
Whether Europe succeeds in protecting future generations with a long-term policy on pesticides remains to be seen. Hiltrud Breyer's report on pesticides will go before the European Parliament within the next few months.
The wide open spaces of the frozen north are slowly beginning to melt. Global warming is driving back the ice cap, fueled in part by human activity. The polar bear has become both a symbol and a victim of the process of climate change.
If the polar bear disappears, we will have food, we will have medicine, we will be wealthy in Europe, I am sure. But but we are also much poorer in that this beautiful and important ecosystem disappears. It is a value issue. Should we have it or should we not?
Kim Holman has a portrait of national hero Roald Amundsen on the wall of his office at the Norwegian Polar Institute in the northern town of Tromsø. Amundsen is best known for beating Scott to the South Pole, but he was also the first to sail the Northwest Passage in 1905. The adventurer battled against frozen sea ice in the summer of that year. But climate models suggest that within a few decades that route could become more than just a myth.
The climate models that we use to learn about what the future climate may be tell us that the Arctic will warm faster and more than any other part of the Earth. That will lead to melting of the ice, and in particular the summer ice will disappear quite rapidly indeed. So by 2050 we expect certainly we expect the summer ice to be gone, maybe earlier.
This model from the Max Planck Institute for Meteorology in Hamburg shows how summer sea ice is disappearing at an accelerating rate. Satellites are a precious tool for climate modelling. ESA's two ERS European remote sensing satellites have been carrying out valuable work studying the ice cap since the early 1990s.
Here in the Arctic, we found mercury contaminating the food chain from the bottom to the top. And at the top of the food chain there are the big predators, and there is man. We want to understand how the mercury gets into the food chain and why in an area which is so far away from any source and which appears so clean and pure, it is becoming so concentrated.
The main sources of atmospheric mercury are mining and industrial combustion. A unique combination of chemical, physical and geographical conditions conspire to concentrate the mercury over the North Pole, falling on the ice sheet. When it's insoluble, mercury is harmless, but after reacting with Arctic bacteria and fungi, it's transformed into a highly toxic form called methyl mercury. As the snow and ice thaws, this toxic mercury seeps into the ocean, and there it's absorbed by plankton and so begins its journey up the food chain. Mercury is what scientists call bioaccumulable. The further up the food chain it travels, the more concentrated it becomes. With humans at the top, some Nordic countries have even advised vulnerable groups not to eat too much of some North Atlantic fish.
We want to find out if the mercury has maybe transformed into this toxic methyl mercury form where there's a threat to the food chain and therefore man. We're doing this research on a biological level. We filter the snow to isolate the bacteria in it, and then we look to see if they're capable of reacting with mercury.
And that's done in sophisticated microbiology labs back in mainland Europe. Researchers in central France have isolated at least 11 different types of Arctic bacteria that they suspect have the ability to change benign atmospheric mercury into the toxic methyl mercury.
These are bacteria we found at the North Pole and extracted from the snow. It's very interesting. We want to know if they're going to react with mercury.
They identify the bacteria and grow them on in a culture medium before they're frozen.
Melissa and Begonia, 30 and 29 respectively, rent an apartment together. Their university years well behind them, they are now employed in journalism and marketing. But the only way either could afford to leave their parents' home was by sharing a place.
I wanted to move out when I was 27. I quickly saw I couldn't. I told the bank how much I earned, and they offered me a 50-year mortgage to buy an apartment. But what sort? For what I could pay, it just didn't exist. That's when we decided to move in together. You can be overjoyed if you manage to get a job that pays more than 700 euros a month. Yes, it's true. I know people who have worked for the same company for a long time whose salary isn't even up to mine. They are stuck. And I'm talking about my 950 euros. They're not up to the 1,000 mark.
Far from the city centre, the pair pay nearly half of their income to cover the 830 euros rent. And demand is keeping business brisk. Madrid is riddled with for sale signs and advertising for bank loans. Banks have adapted to younger buyers' conditions by offering 50-year mortgages. That's not common in Europe. But there's nothing to fear, says this bank director.
People might think that a 50-year credit means they will still be paying it back after they retire. That's true. But it's no less true that Family's Evolution improves their ability to make the payments, making their duration shorter.
Ir aportando al préstamo más cantidad de la que tiene que pagar, de tal forma que puede acortar esa vida del préstamo.
When is it all right for a worker to jump the border to go to work? Rui is Portuguese, but his job is in Spain. His case is common. He'll do the drive 60 kilometers from his home in northern Portugal with a van load of colleagues to a building site in Vigo, Spain. That's causing a lot of bad feeling on the Spanish side, but Rui says the math is pretty simple.
O salário, mesmo assim.
It's the wages. In Portugal, we were earning about half.
Quase metade, praticamente. Tive de ser pelo menos em Ponte Lima.
Pick a number. The government says one thing, the unions say another. It's thought that around 15,000 Portuguese are labouring away in Galicia, the top left corner of Spain, half of them under the official radar. Rui says he has everything in order, but he knows a lot of people who are having a bad time with it.
Acho que tem que lutar pela vida.
They have to earn a living. There's no other way. There hasn't been much work in Portugal for some years, and now there's less of it in Spain as well. We didn't start out with these conditions, but I know lots of people living all together in one apartment. I wouldn't accept staying abroad. I'd prefer to work in Portugal.
Construction in Spain has flourished in the past 10 years, and somewhere along the way the cross-border flow of workers from Portugal became a torrent. Now Spain's unemployment rate has topped 10%, and construction is one of the most affected sectors. Local labourers say that it's unfair that Portuguese workers work for wages lower than the union rate, on site for excessively long hours and no social benefits. Some might call Hammarby Sjöstad in Stockholm a paradise of sustainable development. On a scale of 1 to 10 for eco-friendly, this one's practically 11. It's self-sufficient in energy. That and other features make it a model for European Union researchers, planners and politicians to study within the context of climate change goals. Check out the integrated solar cells in the architecture, for example. Professor Varis Bokalders of the Royal Institute of Technology says the hefty investment in ecological projects is worth every cent.
I think it's a good pilot project. Here you can come and learn how you can fight the climate change, how you can build a part of the city which doesn't release a lot of carbon dioxide, which don't use as much fossil fuels.
Look, no rubbish trucks. The neighbourhood's 25,000 residents simply dump their waste by type into these little coloured pillars and it gets sucked along to a treatment centre. It gets better. Toilet waste shoots into biogas production. This goes to fire up kitchens, heat houses, and even power Stockholm's buses.
The upgrading plants is so big, so we can upgrade more gas than the waste the digesters can produce. So by now we're looking into to get more organic material.
The cars have a tank for petrol and one for biogas. They're a sign of Swedes' conviction that it's worth spending on the environment, a variation of putting their money where their mouth is.
A person's sweat can reveal a lot about their state of health. That's why researchers at the Biotechs project in Dublin want to develop ways of analysing perspiration. Their latest prototype has inbuilt biochemical sensors that record data such as the saltiness, the acidity and the temperature of sweat. The results are sent wirelessly to a computer.
What we do is we take a piece of fabric, and in that fabric we define a fluidic channel, which you can see here. Along that channel we place a pH sensor, conductivity sensor, sodium sensor and temperature sensor. The composition of sweat changes as it ages, so it's important to get it as it's excreted by the body, and this is quite difficult. So what we've done in this system is by defining this channel and placing this absorbent at the end of the channel, we can be continuously pulling fresh sweat through the system and analysing it as the person exercises. And it's not been possible to do this before.
The sports industry would be among the first to gain from wearable technology, like smart shoes or t-shirts equipped with sensors. Studying sweat is not meant to replace traditional methods like blood tests, but rather to complement them.
This is more person-friendly. People don't like to give blood. A lot of people, they get nervous or they feel faint. In the future, we hope to develop this system into a t-shirt, which will integrate other sensors besides what we see here. So we'll have a full physiological picture of a person as they train or exercise.
The technology could soon be used as a weapon in the battle against sports doping, or a tool for physios and trainers to keep an eye on how their athletes are performing. Either way, it's good news for sport.
We're really at the first generation of sensors. I think it'll revolutionise how we prepare our sports team and how we manage our sports teams. We will be able to individually track players, and players who are having decrements in performance, we will be able to assess that at a much earlier stage in the game and to be able to make appropriate changes and to put people in the appropriate positions on the field because of our ability to track real time.
Liftoff is a breathtaking sight. It's the expression of man's audacity and determination to transform dreams into reality. But it's also terrifying. An astronaut remains human, vulnerable, but in control of his own free will.
I remember well. I'd been called up in 1985-1986, just before the Challenger disaster. I was watching television when it happened, and I was supposed to say yes or no. We're very aware of the risks and we accept them. It's a dangerous job. Of course, both the Russians and the Americans had accidents. It will happen again. You can't have exploration without paying a certain price. Death is sad, but it's the price you have to pay to be able to make man progress.
It's an exciting job for those directly involved in the action. For friends and family, though, it's not always easy. There are long periods of separation due to training, and the worry before and during space flights. Psychological stability is an important selection criteria and plays a large part in training. There are two main points to the psychological aspect. Self-care, meaning knowing how to keep yourself fit in mind and body when you're apart from friends, family or children. Or Earth, everything you're used to.
De ses proches, de sa famille, de ses enfants, de ses amis, de sa terre, de ses habitudes.
And then there's teamwork. That's extremely important because conflict can happen anywhere, on the job or away from it. You need to know how to resolve problems between several people. It's different when it's 2 people to when it's 3, or to 5, or to 6 people. In each case, there's a different problem to sort out.
À chaque cadre, il y a un problème différent à régler.
A healthy mind in a healthy body is important, but so is a sharp mind that's willing to learn and a calm temperament. The successful candidate will have a lot on his plate.
Venice, a vision of success. In the 1980s and 90s, small and medium-sized companies, or SMEs, transformed the region around Venice into a national driving force. Then the euro came in, wiping out the advantages of the weak lira. Europe expanded, new competitors emerged. Companies folded like cards, but new strengths developed. The macro region of northern Italy, with some 7 million inhabitants, faced a new challenge, adapting its creativity for today. Here's the president of an internationally successful line of sport and leisure footwear.
There are 2 places in the world with such a concentration of SMEs, California and Northeast Italy. Their respective wealth is comparable, I'd say. In the Northeast, you have lots of small companies that are unknown but important. Walk around and you find workshops making bits for Boeing. Without them, a plane doesn't take off.
Di iniettore che servono per far funzionare un Boeing e senza di quello il Boeing non parte.
Oligato put his ideas to work, building up Italy's #1 shoe group over 13 years. It's #2 in the world.
Our headquarters is in Montebelluna, near the Treviso and Venice airports, where we didn't set up the shoe industry, but did make a new Microsoft. A famous American economist defined GEOPS as an American dream in Italy.
In Amaro, near the Slovenian border, another dream was realized. A high-tech company reversing the brain drain.
It's an early start for Ewald. He's busy tending to his 300 cows on his farm of around 200 hectares. Ewald lives and works 40 kilometres from Aarhus in a small village on Denmark's Jutland Peninsula. He comes from good farming stock, following in the footsteps of his father and grandfather. However, in 1994, Ewald decided to go organic.
I feel I got to be responsible for more than myself, and that's something to do with the nature, the animal health, and about the health for the whole area around myself and my children.
It's a profound change. However, Ewald has his allies in the form of the Danish government, which for the past 20 years has supported organic farming. Alarm bells sounded at the end of the 80s as the environment began to suffer, with a lot of the blame levelled at industrial-scale agriculture. The government in Copenhagen believes food production free from pesticides is the way forward, as the world tries to combat climate change, ensure environmental protection and halt the decline in biodiversity.
In the recent decades we've seen biodiversity decline in agricultural areas. For example, farmland birds have declined by almost 50% over the last 3 decades. We are seeing a huge water crisis gathering, especially in the Mediterranean areas, soil degradation, pollution, very big problems that are still out there and must be faced. We would like to see subsidies reoriented. At the moment, most subsidies are essentially wasted because there is no link between what a farmer does and what money receives.